We're going to talk about it's a little expanding on your last video Dimitri made, and the video is called Blissing Out and the False Rapture. This was Monday, the 30th of January, and it starts in the information box. It starts with the ego can only reach the self via the shadow or the cross. And Martin Luther King also spoke of this, and he says Good Friday comes before Easter, which is the cross, and then you get the resurrection. And we have to start by the beginning, and which is where it all starts. And this is, we call it the individual. We have to really understand what is the individual.
Yes, really, this is actually the. I wanted to give some depth to the video today because it's basically in 10 minutes. It's very difficult to really do justice to this topic. So just consider this like a going deeper into the topic. But so yes, the whole problem lies actually in the idea of understanding the whole idea of the cross and the resurrection and all of that is basically what it is that it's basically tracking the development of consciousness, the evolution of consciousness, and the whole reason for the whole history is actually different stages in the evolution of consciousness. And if we do not understand the whole cycle, then it becomes actually impossible to understand one stage in the whole cycle. And this is, I think, a major problem right now, because what we find is every 2,000 years, if you wish, every stage, one could say that you get a major figure, Christ figure, that emerges. Basically, what that means is that some figure emerges to show us the next step, to symbolize, to represent the next step, to model the next step in the development of consciousness. And so this is basically where the movie Zeitgeist understood it wrong. They had some facts, but they didn't understand the big picture, because what they realized, what they saw is that that before Jesus, if you wish, there were many other figures that were Christ-like and prefigured, if you wish, Jesus, and then they drew the wrong conclusion that Jesus would be like, just say, a recurrence of the older gods, if you wish. That it was not really something authentic, and because there were so many details that could be linked back to other Christ forms. But what important part of that is that what you see there is that there is an evolution in consciousness happening. And this is you would find that, for instance, in the history of art, you would see that every period there's a shift in art. Like, for instance, when we started off, there was a time that we didn't used to make art with shadow and light. That's the beginning of the idea of shadow and light in art. And depth is a complete new stage. What you're seeing there is new stages in consciousness, collective stages in consciousness. Like if you go back to the Egyptians, you would have like basically a 2D, a 3D, a kind of a flat 2D situation. Like these hieroglyphs would be 2D. They wouldn't be painting with depth. And then all of a sudden you find a stage where you had the shadow and the light, which would be depth. And for instance, in old Greece, there was no pictorial depiction of things. It was more fun, otherworldly, these heroic right, it was still very stuck in a kind of uh, otherworldly mythological view of things. But what we're getting at there, and this is basically what Jung discovered, is that every what we see are different stages in the evolution of consciousness. Why am I explaining it like this? Is because if you don't know the whole cycle and you don't know what every cycle means, then you don't know what cycle we are in now. And so, for instance, the whole idea, actually, what I'm getting at is that we have evolved so many thousands of years to the evolution of the individual. In the olden day, for instance, the indigenous were very whole, but they had no individual. So then you had, for instance, you could say the whole development of Western culture is symbolized when, for instance, the Jews fled Egypt, in which they were slaves. So then the whole idea of this, the beginning of the whole thing was that we were still in this collectivist culture, which would be symbolized by Egypt and the Pharaoh, and then the Jews escaped with Moses. And this, if you compare that with Genesis, you would see that what we're getting at in terms of consciousness is the beginning of a new stage, the beginning of consciousness, actually, because in the beginning you could say that in that old Egypt or in the Garden of Eden you would have like indigenous peoples, but they were very whole, very one with everything, but there was still no self-consciousness. For instance, they would be walking around naked and they didn't really realize they were naked. And we still have cultures around the world that are indigenous and that are like that. So the whole history started when the Jews, as it were, fled from that dictatorship from old Egypt, if you wish, or when Adam and Eve ate from the fruit. And then you have that was said that now that they ate from the fruit, they have become like us, knowing the knowledge of good and bad. Us are the gods. So one could almost say that that was the beginning of the human being falling out of that whole original wholeness, but on a track towards becoming like the gods.
Why are you saying that? Gods?
Because the whole thing actually is like
it was kind of sad to be sent out of the Garden of Eden.
Exactly, but at the same time, there is this incredible purpose to it. Because in the Garden of Eden, we would be whole and complete, but not self-aware, and this is where the whole purpose of it comes in. Because you could almost say like we were these perfect creatures, and then all of a sudden the gods say, now they have become like us. Actually, they will become like us. And I would say that the transition in between would be like going from creature to creator. And the whole purpose of all these stages of consciousness would be that slowly the individual had to, I'm going to like fast forward here so that you can maybe get in, but the whole idea would be like the different stages of the birthing of the individual.
You see that as the end stage, to become a self-aware.
Right. The whole idea is, and we can track this. Jung, in tracking the history of mythology, actually was tracking the history of consciousness and what the whole thing is all about. Like Darwin looked at history as the survival of the fittest, which is a complete misread. But for instance, Jung and Pauli actually converged upon the idea of a synchronistic evolution, meaning that there was a meaningful plan according to which evolution would occur, not this blind survival of the fittest, like a blind evolution or whatever. There was a meaning. And Pauli, the great Pauli, I say this in terms of Western science, Pauli understood this. Pauli wrote an article about this in which Pauli realized that there was a synchronistic evolution, so it was not random, meaning that there was a purpose to it. And the purpose to it is to fast forward the whole thing. But the purpose actually is that we would need to give birth to the ego. And the ego would be like the first stages to becoming self-conscious. And out of that self-consciousness, we would reborn as what you would call, like in the beginning, they would call like the higher Adam or the Adam Kadmon. But then we would be reborn as a complete being, but self-aware, and that would be, as a collective, indeed, almost like becoming like them. Which is what Genesis said. They have become like us, knowing good and evil, which are and Genesis says us.
Gods.
Yes, which means the gods. But this is the point is that this thing started with the Jews that left Egypt. We are the Jews. We are.
So out of a collective culture, indigenous culture,
Right.
you get the ego.
Yes.
Get birthed.
Right. Out of this collectivist culture comes a group that eventually becomes like this ego group. This is, we would have to get into a stage in which this ego would be able to do great evil and would eventually become very materialistic and greedy, which is what is symbolized by the golden calf, and how the Jews would then start to worship the calf, and Moses would be very angry at this. But this was a necessary stage in the process of evolution of consciousness towards becoming what I would call the real individual, which is the self with a capital S. And then you would have, after this stage in which this is a necessary evil, which would be materialism, the ego is automatically possessed by materialism. And we can discuss that further later, but the point, just to get the big picture. And then out of that came, after that came Jesus, if you wish. And Jesus would then be basically showing us the stage beyond the ego. So one could say that there was yes, and then there's obviously there's a group of the Jews that would not follow Jesus. But Jesus, in a sense of showing that next step of the cross, which is the shadow,